I'll start with a question about why now, and that's essentially that we're coming out of a recession. That's debatable, but signs are right now that the economy is beginning to grow again, although jobs are still taking a hit. My question to you is that with the Copenhagen conference in December, is now the right time to be taking really aggressive action on climate change?
Well, the hour is very late, and Copenhagen is really our best chance. I mean, the last time we got the nations of the world together was at Kyoto, and that was, more than 10 years ago. And it's not easy to construct these international summits. And in the meantime, with the advance of the global climate change, the rising temperatures are clearly going to cause real hardship in terms of rising sea levels, changes in agriculture, health problems, really huge impacts on the well-being of nations and people. We just have to come together and get it done.
So, listening to everything that you've said, this isn't really a new revelation that we've known that climate change is a serious issue. We know what some of the effects could be. We've maybe even witnessed some of the effects already. But what's going on here? Why hasn't there been action taken beforehand? Why are we in 2009 and talking about whether or not to take action?
Well, it's a tough issue, frankly, because the effects, which are inevitable, are going to be very damaging and very real, are not something that you see in your day-to-day life. You really need to understand that these are cumulative effects, and they're going to have an enormous impact in our lifetime and on the next generation. When you're busy raising kids, trying to earn a living, it's a little hard to understand in the face of all the problems we face next week, next month, why it's important. But it surely inevitably is. And for the sake of the planet, for the sake of our countries, most importantly, for the sake of our immediate families, our kids and our grandchildren, we have a deep moral obligation to deal with this rather than sort of casting all the potential wreckage, the human wreckage, the ecological wreckage, the relocations of tens of millions of people, the implications for national security, just blithely ignoring them and saying it's not happening tomorrow and therefore it's not our concern. It is our concern. It is a moral issue.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned how taking action will affect generations in the future, and you also, when you spoke with the Marshall Scholars, you sort of challenged them to take on the issue as the issue of their generation. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think each generation, faces its own set of problems, and heaven knows there are plenty of them confronting us in this world. But in terms of the pervasiveness of the effects, this is surely the largest and the most difficult problem we face. It's not going to be solved in one conference. The beginning surely lies at the end of the road to Copenhagen, but it's going to take a personal effort in terms of a conservation ethic, in terms of, in the United States, for example, putting more pressure on our elected representatives to pass a climate change bill, in our support for reduction of energy use efficiency, better technologies. The solution is all of us. It's not just Copenhagen, and it'll be with us for our lifetime in terms of the way we work and use the economic and political system to make millions of individual and collective choices about how we live, about efficiency, about a pervasive move from a carbon-based energy system to renewable sources.
So what you're talking about there is what would reasonably be at least a few decades if not longer, sort of transition.
The-
What does solving climate change look like to you? What would you expect to see come out of Copenhagen? And then more big picture here, how does that play into how do we actually solve climate change? How do we tackle it?
Well, there's no question that we are at the 11th hour, and almost any thoughtful scenario leads to the conclusion that we're going to have to reduce carbon emissions from fossil fuels by 50 to 80% in this generation in order to prevent catastrophic rises in temperature around the world. The importance of Copenhagen is that we have to have a strong collective agreement that this is a international and national priority, and a firming up of some targets. I mean, we all do best when we have yardsticks and targets, and that includes not just individuals, but nations. That's what we need from Copenhagen. But beyond that, it's going to take a massive, decades-long effort at every level of government, and at the personal level, too, to become energy efficient, to redesign our cities, to redesign energy systems, and indeed our entire lifestyles, to see if we can cumulatively reach both to reduce emissions and simultaneously and as a part of that, to move toward non-carbon energy sources.
So at Copenhagen, you'll have a lot of different parties there. You'll have, of course, the United States, you'll have the UK, other European countries, but you also have China, and you'll have Brazil, and you'll have India, and other sorts of representatives of emerging economies, developing economies. How do these developed economies, such as in Europe and the United States, come together with developing economies to tackle this issue?
The divide between the developed world and the developing countries has not yet been bridged. I don't think the bridge will be completely built in Copenhagen. The emerging economies, as I read the situation, are not ready to agree to numerical targets, and there's going to have to be a much larger effort, both in the United States and Europe, to say we must lead with commitments to reductions, confident that the emerging economies and countries will come along. It's understandable that they're not offering to lead for all of the reasons that we know well. They're behind in the economic trajectory. They don't bear responsibility for most of the carbon that the developing nations have put into the atmosphere. So even if we don't get a solid agreement, the developing countries must step forward and acknowledge that the mere act of leadership and results will, in good time, bring the emerging nations along. There are models for that. The Montreal Protocol, which was the convention to phase out fluorocarbons that were creating the ozone hole, is a really interesting example. The developing countries in step one after the Montreal Protocol went ahead with reductions, and the developing countries came along in step two, driven by the leadership example and the incentives that were set up through the leadership of Europe and the United States. I think that's the model that will probably come out of Copenhagen.